Bon matin, bienvenue au Théâtre National de Presse.
Good morning,
welcome everyone
to
the National Press Theatre in
Theatre.
Ottawa for the report of the Chair and Vice Chair of the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation. We have the Honourable McLellan. She will lead off with the English portion, and after that, Dr. Mark Ware. He's the Vice Chair, and he'll be doing the French section. And then we have to be done by about 11:30. So I'll open the question list and hand over to Anne McLellan.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tous et toutes. I am Anne McLellan, and I am chair of the Task Force on Cannabis Legalization and Regulation. With me is Dr. Mark Ware, who has served as vice chair to this task force. On behalf of the 9-person task force, we are pleased today to present our report, a framework for the legalization and regulation of cannabis in Canada, to the Ministers of Justice, Public Safety and Health. This report fulfills our mandate to consult and provide independent advice on the design of a new legislative and regulatory framework. I would like to thank all task force members for their dedication and thoughtful counsel throughout this process. Members volunteered time and energy throughout the summer and fall to develop this report. Their expertise in the fields of public health, law enforcement, and justice were essential in ensuring that this report reflects an understanding of the perspectives we heard. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Mr. Bill Blair, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice, who served as government liaison to the task force and provided valuable support throughout this process. The advice contained in our report is the culmination of more than 5 months of work. We traveled across the country and heard from Canadians, including representatives of Indigenous communities, parents, youth, and patients who use cannabis for medical purposes. We spent time with experts and organizations who shared their diverse perspectives and helped us to appreciate the complexities of legalization and regulation. We met with officials from provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments who emphasized the need for close collaboration amongst all levels of government. We traveled to Colorado and Washington and spoke to officials in the government of Uruguay, the only other country to have legalized access to cannabis, to hear directly from those who have had first-hand experience in enacting systems for legal access to cannabis. Mark and I would like to thank all of those with whom we met, as well as those experts, organizations, and Canadians who took the time to provide us with close to 30,000 responses. Our report contains more than 80 recommendations. Our advice details safeguards we believe are important to achieve the objectives set out by the government to better protect the health and safety of Canadians by regulating access to cannabis. Our report presents measures to create a viable legal market, which will be essential to meet the government's objective of displacing the entrenched illicit market that exists in Canada today. And in setting out these measures, we recommend taking a public health approach to minimize harms associated with cannabis use. We recommend a series of actions to educate Canadians in advance of the coming changes in order to increase overall awareness and knowledge of cannabis, including risks related to impaired driving. We recommend the establishment of a well-regulated production, manufacturing, and distribution environment, including production safety controls, which would specify important things like appropriate pesticide use, safe packaging, and labeling requirements. We recommend rules to protect youth, including a minimum age of 18 to purchase cannabis and restrictions on marketing and promotional activities. Generally, we believe that it is appropriate to proceed with caution. We are only the second nation to move forward in this way, and we were told by those who have gone before to expect surprises. While there are important lessons to be learned from places like Colorado and Washington State, designing and implementing a Canadian system is a unique undertaking. Continued research will help us to better understand and mitigate risks associated with problematic use. We also encourage additional research to enhance our understanding of the health benefits of cannabis. This is particularly important when considering questions of cannabis for medical use. We did hear compelling accounts from patients who told us of the benefits they experience from cannabis use, and from researchers and the medical community who call for more evidence to better understand its therapeutic potential. It is for this reason, as well as existing jurisprudence, that we recommend maintaining the current regulations for medical access to cannabis. In our judgment, the government will be in a better position to determine changes to the medical access system once the new system for legal access is established. As we make clear in our report, certain activities should remain subject to criminal penalties. For example, those who are found to be producing outside the legal system, or who are found to be selling to minors or into international markets, or who operate a motor vehicle while impaired by cannabis. On the other hand, we believe that administrative sanctions, such as tickets or fines, are appropriate for minor offenses. The overall integrity and success of this new system depends in large part on the effective enforcement of the new rules. Therefore, we encourage all levels of government to make the necessary investments to increase capacity in enforcement activities, especially in the initial years of implementation. Our report makes clear that this initiative is complex and that collaboration among governments is critical to its overall success. The recommendations in our report, taken together, outline the foundations for a new system of regulatory safeguards for legal access to cannabis that aims to better protect health and to enhance public safety. We provide our report to the ministers today with the conviction that Canada is well positioned to undertake this work carefully and safely. Thank you for your attention, and I will now ask my Vice Chair, Dr. Mark Ware, to make some remarks. Mark.
Merci, Anne, et bonjour tout le monde. Comme Madame McLellan l'a indiqué, je suis le Dr. Mark Ware et j'assume la fonction de vice-président dans ce groupe de travail indépendant. À titre de médecin clinicien qui s'intéresse particulièrement à la gestion de la douleur, j'étudie depuis longtemps le cannabis à des fins médicales.
Approved and used cannabis for medical purposes. There are Canadians that have used it, benefited from it, and it brought us to the point where we are. This is an important and positive step in the evolution of its use, and I'm honored to have played a role in this. I would like to echo what Ms. McLellan has said and to thank everybody who has participated in the consultation process. I want to thank the members of the task force for their devotion, dedication, and enthusiasm. I would like to thank our chair in particular for her leadership. This task force was indicative of the government's proper choice. On behalf of the whole task force, I say our report was produced because of the leadership and the devotion of our chair in its final form, its high-quality form. As Ms. McLellan has said, there are more than 80 recommendations in the report, but I would like to highlight certain aspects of that report. Our recommendations describe in detail the safeguards that we feel are important to allow us to attain the objectives that have been set by by the government. That is, to better protect the health and safety of Canadians by regulating access to cannabis. Our report presents measures that are intended to create a legal market. This is one of the goals of the government, and it will be essential to displace the illegal market that exists at present in Canada. In terms of the overall measures, we recommend that the government approach a public health approach to reduce to a minimum the negative injurious effects of cannabis. That means that we all have to be aware of studies related to consumption, the risks involving a vulnerable population, and also the risks stemming from the illegal drug market. We want to see that there will be a regulatory framework that will allow the purchaser to obtain cannabis. And therefore, we recommend measures like limiting the quantity and size, height of the plant, the process of manufacturing for the end product, reasonable concerns for safeguards and oversight by local authorities. We feel that it is appropriate to act prudently. More research will help us to mitigate the risks involved with the consumption of cannabis and to allow us to better understand the advantages of it. It's particularly important when studying cannabis for medical purposes and its use. We heard the very convincing testimony of patients who told us that when they consumed cannabis, that it had a beneficial effect. And we also heard researchers who allowed us to better understand the therapeutic effect of cannabis. Doctors and patients' interests all will be better served by clinical scientific approaches to the therapeutic use of cannabis. We recognize the need to develop and implement an outreach information program to help people understand this new regulatory system for cannabis. Canadians need appropriate, balanced, and credible information on cannabis to ensure that the strategic efforts meet Canadians' needs. New information, of course, will emerge over time as we put in place the new measures and watch over the new regulatory framework. There is a need for flexibility, though, in this new policy. As our report indicates, it's a very complex process. Cooperation between levels of government is crucial to ensure its overall success. In the report, the foundations of the new system are set out, which embodies legal access to cannabis to improve public health and health in general. As our chair has said, we are presenting our report today to the ministers, and we are convinced that Canada is very well placed to undertake this work prudently and safely. I thank you for your time, and we will now entertain your questions.
We have 12 colleagues on this list, and we were allotted until about 11:30 for questions, and we've still got to get to the phones for a couple West Coast after that. So consider the question list now closed, and we'll begin with Daniel LeBlanc of the Globe and Mail.
Hello, Ms. McLellan.
Good morning. How are you, Daniel?
Very good. So the government will present legislation in the spring of next year. Do you think the regime can be put in place in 2017, 2018, 2019? When do you think this can be in place?
That is actually a decision for the Government of Canada. Our mandate was to provide advice to the government as to how they could go about legalization and creating a regulatory regime. Timelines from this point on in relation to implementation issues are up to the Government of Canada.
There are rules on production and distribution that you propose. Will this be corporate cannabis, or do you want this to be more of a corporate cannabis culture that people who are already in the business can also join in, or will it only be corporate Canada that can be part of this?
I think it's very clear that we heard from a great many parties that they wanted a diversity of producers, and we agree with that. I'm not sure that how I would define your phrase corporate Canada, but what I would say is that our goal is a diversity of producers. And even now with the licensed producers, many people don't understand that there are large licensed producers, but the vast majority of them aren't large. Some of them are actually quite small and have been able to meet the regulatory standards presently in place. So we would like to see, we know there are lots of growers out there, Daniel, who are producing illegally, obviously outside the system. We would hope that some, at least some of those, will wish to come within the new legal regime and will be able to meet the standards to do that. Sorry, go ahead.
Excuse-moi. Louis Blain, Société Radio-Canada.
Monsieur Dr. Ware, j'aimerais savoir
Dr.
au niveau de
Ware,
l'échéancier.
with respect to the time frame, are you going to be able to do that when the government wants? When will it be formally legalized? Well, as our chair has just said, this is a government question. It should be addressed to the government. It is up to the government to decide upon the timing for the implementation of the legislation and to make cannabis legal. It seems that there's scientific evidence lacking, particularly with respect to impaired driving. There is some scientific work that remains to be done. Would you not agree? I think it's important to note that there is a solid ensemble of work that already exists. There are a variety of interpretations that can be given to the existing data and evidence. But what we want to do is to establish a mechanism that will allow us to do more research and will allow for the prevention of health problems that might be associated with cannabis.
To suggest a storefront model. I think when you look at what's happening in a lot of communities with dispensaries right now, that's causing serious concerns. So I wonder how you see this new model shaping up and whether or not some of those concerns about dispensaries will continue to exist under this new model.
As you are probably aware, in the report in Chapter 3, we talk about not only production and manufacturing, but wholesale and retail distribution. And we make the point very clearly that actually wholesale and retail distribution is within the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories. And that was a position, as you can imagine, the provinces and territories made very clear to us. So final decisions around the form of retail will be up to provinces, probably working with municipalities and the communities they represent. But certainly there are a number of models which we discuss in the report. But at the end of the day, we are very respectful of the fact that any final decision around that model will be up to the provinces, probably in consultation with municipalities and local communities.
I also note that you talk about maintaining criminal penalties in some areas. I believe that the present government's platform commitment was actually to increase the criminal penalties when it comes to things like selling to youth. I wonder if you have any thoughts on, in fact, whether we ought to see harsher punishments in some cases.
Well, we clearly talk about the fact that it is important for us as a task force to retain or maintain criminal sanctions. What the exact penalty might be or sentence in relation to those criminal prohibitions would be something that I am sure the Department of Justice would take a look at. But we did not make recommendations in terms of the exact, should it be a minimum sentence or should it be X number of years, summary conviction versus indictment. No, those were not things that we saw within our mandate, but we were pretty clear about the kinds of things that we thought should continue to be subject to criminal prohibitions.
David Younger, Reuters.
Good morning. You talk about the desire to set up a diverse market, but isn't it the case that once cannabis is legalized, the major or large producers are going to ramp up production? How do you protect the little ones from being squished and not having a chance to get off the ground?
I think let me say that, first of all, we make the point that diversity is an important value in relation to the producers. There will be means by which the government, going forward through implementation, could ensure a certain degree of diversity. There are different kinds of market interventions that a government could choose to adopt or apply to ensure a degree of diversity. And going forward, I think as the market develops, we recommend that that is something that the government watch pretty carefully.
But there's a difference between watching carefully and actually recommending they do it. Do you think the government should bring in some of these measures you're talking about?
I think the government needs to understand the value of a diverse market with growers of different sizes and arguably different expertise and so on. But at the end of the day, how that market ultimately develops is up to the Government of Canada and, quite honestly, the marketplace.
Bruce Cheadle, the Canadian Press.
Hi, you mentioned the diversity of views you received. I'm just wondering what the task force, if there was an issue you found most vexing, and where were the areas where you found the most kind of commonality, where there was broad consensus?
Mark, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, I think over the course of the months that we spent on this report, there were several issues that came up that were predominantly that took the longest parts of discussion. The cannabis and driving was one. The youth, the age at which cannabis use should be considered legal. These were probably two of the major ones. The less stringent issues were probably the federal, provincial jurisdictions regarding cultivation on the federal side, provincial responsibility for managing the retail side of things. So those were probably the two ends of the extremes in terms of what was most challenging and where there was most alignment.
You mentioned this is a federal initiative, and yet you're recommending that the provinces and municipalities do the regulation. Did you get any pushback from provinces or municipalities as saying we don't want to have to be the ones to bring this in?
I think in the same way that we heard a diversity of opinions from Canadians, we heard a diversity of opinions from the provinces and territories. Some of them were much more prepared and ready to engage. Some of them were still in the process of working through their own thinking on the issues. So I think what we hope to do is to see really strong collaboration between the federal government and the provinces to ensure that there's adequate support, that there's adequate collaboration, and that these models emerge and roll out in as effective and as safe a way as possible.
Julie Van Dusen.
Hi, Ms. McLellan. I notice you use words like prudence and caution and surprises await you and so on. Are you convinced that legalization is the way to go? And if so, why?
Yes. I think obviously all 9 members of the task force would not have taken up this task over the past 5 months if we did not believe that as a matter of public policy, legalization now is the time to to move away from a system that for decades has been based on prohibition of cannabis into a regulated legal market. And I think we're all aware of the challenges and societal problems that the existing system has created. Certainly the existing system of prohibition has allowed illicit criminal organizations to flourish in this area. We have also seen, because of criminal code prohibitions against simple possession, the criminalization of many Canadians, many young Canadians, and we know the effects of the long-term, if you like, stigma and consequences of a criminal conviction. There's no question that you look not only in this country and where people and Canadians' thinking is at, but in many other jurisdictions, that people are coming to the conclusion that the prohibition, the prohibitory regime that has existed is not working, and it is not meeting the basic principles of public health and safety that have to be at the core of this kind of public policy.
So my follow-up, you talked about all those people that have criminal records. What happens to them? Are you suggesting an amnesty? I didn't see it in
that. Was not part of our mandate. We are forward-looking in terms of with legalization, what would a new regulatory regime look like in this country? It will be up to the Minister of Justice to determine if she and the Government of Canada wish to make any recommendation in relation to those who have been convicted of simple possession in the past.
Paul Vera, The Wall Street Journal.
It's kind of tied into what Julie just asked, but you mentioned Uruguay, that Canada is going to be the largest advanced economy that's going down this road. How much pressure is there on policymakers to get this right? And did the lack of global experience, were there places that did provide some insight? Any of the U.S. states? Where did you go that was most helpful to learn about how to do this?
To your first point, it's very important, I should think, to the Government of Canada to get this right. It was important to us as a task force to become as well informed as possible and provide the most concrete, balanced recommendations, keeping in mind the government's overall public policy objectives around public safety and public health. In terms of jurisdictions, Mark took half the task force to Colorado, and you might like to comment a bit on some of the useful lessons we learned there. I took half of the task force to Washington. The basic lessons, I think, are expect surprises. It doesn't matter. We can look at what Colorado has done and the surprises they dealt with. We can look at Washington. We can look at Uruguay. But there will still be surprises. And to your point, we are the largest developed country to ever move on legalization. And therefore, Uruguay is an important example, but a country of some 3.6 million people. Therefore, some of their challenges were different, some of them easier to meet than will be the case here at home in Canada. But we went where we thought it would be the most useful for us in terms of learning lessons and hopefully helping the government avoid unintended consequences going forward. But Mark, you might like to comment on some of the lessons that we have learned from others.
We were very impressed at the time that people gave us from jurisdictions like Colorado, Washington State, Uruguay, the time they gave us to share with us the experiences that they had had in designing and implementing their policies. The key takeaways for us predominantly were, these are the mistakes we made, don't make the same mistakes we did, know that you're going into territory that is relatively unfounded, and learn as you go. Make sure that you set up the baseline measures so that you understand where you're starting from, and then as the policy rolls out, as the country learns to manage with this new regulatory framework, you are constantly learning as you go along, and that can then, and you build flexibility into the framework that allows it to adapt as you go.
very quickly on the just mistakes. I think one of the mistakes you pointed out in the report was taxation, about somehow some jurisdictions put the taxation too high, and that had effects on the illicit contribution. Just on the whole section of taxation, are you suggesting that all the revenue that is raised go back into law enforcement and public health? Is that my understanding, as opposed to general revenue?
I don't think we quantify. I know we don't quantify where 100% of the revenue should go. And in fact, the whole question around revenue going forward is one on which there is a wide variety at this point of nothing more than guesses and estimates. But we do make the case clearly in this report, and maybe Mark and I would both and the task force underscore this for all governments, that revenue that is gained from creating this new legal market, some substantial part of it, especially at the outset, should be going into public education, should be going into enforcement, inspection, should be going into ensuring that the Government of Canada on the production side has the capacity and expertise to license producers who apply in a timely fashion. All this, there is going to have to be additional capacity built to deliver this system, to implement this system, and get it off the ground in a successful way. This is going to take upfront resources long before government sees any revenue. And then in terms of your question, the revenue stream, we do make some pretty clear recommendations in terms of where we think at least some part of that revenue should go.
Michael Couture, Global News.
Ms. McLellan, you talked, actually Dr. Ware talked about how vexing and difficult it was on setting on the implementation and testing for impairment. How troubling of an aspect was this for you, given that you're essentially going to throw the doors open to legalization, but not be able to sort of get the horses back in afterwards if somebody takes the wheel and they're impaired? Because you acknowledge in the report that there's no real good test yet.
People need to keep in mind that drug-impaired driving is already a problem or a challenge in this country, right? This is not going to be a new challenge that is created by legalization. Drug-impaired driving is a problem or a challenge in Canada today. That is why the science is very quickly catching up to the challenge. But are we quite there yet? No. But right now, for example, the OPP, the RCMP, and other police forces across the country are testing, at least to the best of my knowledge, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 roadside oral fluid testing devices to determine which, if any of those 3, might be, let me call it the breakthrough, that science and law enforcement and government and Canadians are all hoping for. It is clear that THC metabolizes differently in the body than alcohol metabolizes in the blood. That's why you can't simply adopt a BAC approach to determining impairment, and that's what you've got to focus on here. It's not actually the amount of THC in the blood, but it's around the question of impairment. And what I would say is that there is a lot of research being done, not only in Canada, but around the world, because this is an ongoing challenge. The Australians have done some interesting work. Obviously, in the United States, some good scientific work is being done. And in the report, as you probably are aware, the Drug and Driving Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Canadian forensic scientists, have been charged by the Department of Justice and the Department of Public Safety to look at this very question. Is it possible, based on the science, to create a per se limit, such as we have with alcohol? And they have been asked that question, among others, as it relates to drug-impaired driving. I think the government anticipates a report from the DDC in the coming months. And we hope that the DDC takes a look in terms of what we say about drug-impaired, cannabis-impaired driving. At the bottom, at the end of all this, we have been brought up in a society where you don't drink and drive. You should not take cannabis in whatever form and drive. And that should be a key part of any public education campaign, which we are also recommending.
As a follow-up to Dr. Ware, being a doctor who has researched this for years, how difficult was it for you, or did you wrestle with the minimum age of 18, given that there is some medical evidence out there showing that the brain is still developing up to 25, balancing it with the illicit drug trade, and how we know that the use would be higher in that sort of age bracket? For you as a medical professional, how difficult is it to set 18 as a limit?
I think that the challenge of setting an age limit is always the balance between the potential risks to the brain and to the developing adolescent health versus the risk of the black market. And so there was always this balance between trying to ensure that there was safety on one side and safety on the other, quite frankly. The science in many areas of cannabis is sometimes non-existent. Sometimes it's contradictory. There are studies which show one thing, there are other studies that show others. There are differences in interpretation of the same data. During our report, we had several reviews coming out of Colorado about whether the experiment there was successful or not. And the same data, people draw very different conclusions. So in this particular area, we're constantly challenged by data interpretation and sometimes lack of data. I think that where we've arrived is a fairly sensible point at which to draw a line that Canadian adults can make decisions. The critical point is that they're educated and informed about the decision that they're making. And I think that's the critical piece. The age, to some extent, is a line in the sand. What matters is how we teach parents, children, the public about what the potential risks and harms of cannabis use are, especially when used very young, 12, 13, especially high concentrations of THC at very early age, especially high frequency. But also, it's not just the drug, it's the social determinants of health that go around people who are using cannabis that early, that much. There are other issues going on. We cannot separate the drug use itself from the society that people live in who are using drugs in that way. So we have to address all of these factors. And I think where we've arrived is a fairly decent balance and something that we should work with and build the education programs around.
Leslie Young, Global.
So to follow up a bit on what Mike was asking, do you think that when this legislation actually goes through, that there should be a legal limit for impaired driving of some kind? And what would that be based on at this point in time?
You're asking about whether we think there should be a per se limit. Yes. Is that your question? In fact, the answer would be yes if we had the science to back up the per se limit. That's the challenge right now. The science is not quite there, but the science is very quickly catching up, and that's what the DDC has been asked to consider right now. And it will be obviously instructive to all of us to see what they conclude. There are jurisdictions that have imposed per se limits, and we felt that we looked at the challenges, we looked at what other countries have done, other states have done, but ultimately concluded because of the work the DDC is doing, it would be peremptory of us to suggest a per se limit when they are the forensic scientists, when they are doing a much deeper dive in terms of all the science. And it is developing, almost on a daily basis, you get another report from some part of the world where science, our knowledge is becoming more refined in terms of what a THC level, an appropriate THC level that would speak to impairment, which then permits you with confidence to establish a per se limit, and one that you hope, and prosecutors, because we talk to prosecutors, prosecutors would hope would in fact stand up in court.
And you suggest creating a maximum strength, I guess, for edible products, but not necessarily for other products. Can you explain why?
Sorry, maximum strength, you mean potency?
Perhaps
per
I can
serving?
address that. You're talking about the recommendation to have edible portions with a limited amount of THC per dose. That, again, comes out of experience shared with Colorado, where they did not label and adequately warn the public when they were using edibles what the quantity of THC in the servings that they were taking. And as a result of that, they saw some public health issues emerge. So we recommended that edible products that be prepared not be appealing to children, be wrapped in very plain packaging, and be adequately labeled in terms of the amount of THC and other cannabinoids that are in there, so that the consumer knows what they're taking, and that is a standardized dose of 5 milligram per dose of THC in an edible quantity is sufficient to provide enough of the drug to have a desired effect, but not such a high dose that's associated with increase in adverse events.
Conroy Le Devoir. Manon?
Merci.
Thank you.
Je trouve que vous prenez ça un peu facile, dire que
I
c'est au
think
gouvernement de décider
that it might be just a little too easy to say it's up to the government to decide, but you're right. We have to look at the capability not yet derived from research. We have to look at all the resources and put those resources within the reach of the government before developing the system. Would you not agree that this is an expression of prudence, as you see it? The timing, once again, of the legislation is a matter for the government to decide. What we have put in place before the tabling of the legislation and eventually the implementation of future legislation is to see that there is research and education to lay the ground for the legislation. Ms. McLellan.
Yep. So what do you think about the fact that young people are still criminalized for something they will do without problem in maybe 6 months, 1 year? As an ex-Minister of Justice, would you recommend that the criminalization we stop criminalizing young people for just smoking a joint?
Well, in fact, that's going forward. Once the new regime is in place and implemented, that's what will happen. Oh, you mean now, Matt? No.
As an ex-Minister of Justice, what do you think of it?
You know, as an ex-Minister of Justice, I can probably do no better than the Prime Minister himself at the Toronto Star editorial board, where he made the point very clearly, and one that Mr. Blair has made, and one that I would make here this morning, that until such time as the law changes, the law as it exists should be enforced. That people understand what the law is today. And we are a country that operates under the rule of law. And until the law is changed, and in whatever form it ultimately is changed, we're a task force making recommendations to the government. People should be aware of what the law is. I think people generally are in this area, and that the law should be enforced. I, as a lawyer, let alone the former Minister of Justice, could not advocate that one disobey the existing law.
Alain Marquis, Press Canadian.
Bonjour, peut-être pour le Dr.
Thank you. Dr. Ware, my question is for you. I want to come back to an issue that was raised earlier. Ms. McLellan says that it is already a problem, but you say that you have heard much concern. I have to ask you to put the camera clicking is making your question inaudible. Can you please repeat? Of course. When you move your hands, then they want to take a picture. Ms. McLellan says this is really not a new challenge, but Colorado's experience has shown us what they had to face. There is no clear recommendation I find about this. So why didn't you make a clear recommendation? Wouldn't it be more prudent for the government to push concerns that are not yet settled further back in time? Are you talking about impaired driving? Yes. Well, it's clear that the recommendation that we have made, I feel, is quite clear. You should not drive under the influence of cannabis. But the problem is, how can you demonstrate this to determine whether the level of THC in the blood constitutes impaired driving? For the moment, science has not been able to demonstrate that, and therefore it would not be responsible for us to make a recommendation based on something that has not yet been scientifically proven. There are many scientists who are working on this issue who are seeking to give the police or any other law enforcement agencies the tools they need. We want to provide better understanding about roadside protection, detection rather. We want to ensure that DRE drug roadside evaluation system is well understood and implemented. So we want to have the possibility of assessing the level in the blood. So this is a specific recommendation that you are making with respect to impaired driving, drug-impaired driving. One of the suggestions we make is that this would be an issue for, that is, drug-impaired driving would be an issue for the future. It's a continuing problem, and it's one of the recommendations that it should be left in the criminal code for the time being. If there is a severe outcome. But,
okay.
No, probably not. Add specifically that marijuana, drug-impaired driving under the influence of marijuana is a criminal offense.
Yeah, that may be going more detail than we went into in specifying exactly what was written into the criminal code or not.
Keep in mind, drug-impaired charges are being laid now every day in this country, whether you're impaired by opioids, cannabis, prescription drugs. Those charges are being laid and convictions are being gained in courts all over this country. So that's why I don't want, and Mark and I don't want to leave the impression that, one, drug-impaired driving is a new challenge in Canada, and two, that there are not laws and tests. And Mark has referenced our DRE officers. Yes, we talk about the fact we don't have enough of them, and we need better training, and we need training, bilingual training, and so on. But we don't want to leave here this morning suggesting to you that drug-impaired driving is not being prosecuted in Canadian courts today. It is.
Dernier collègue dans ma liste, c'est Michel Lamarche de TVA.
Michel Lamarche, our last colleague with a question. I have a question for you, Dr. Ware. You earlier were speaking about the concerns that were raised during the hearings. What are the greatest concerns that were expressed to you with respect to the legalization and regulation of cannabis? I think that in this discussion, this 30-minute discussion today, I think we have spent a lot of time discussing drug-impaired driving. This is a very important issue. It's a message of public education and support that has to be very clear. The government has to act quickly, you say, bring it in, say, by the spring. What aspect precisely, and there are many, to your mind, should the government be most vigilant about? Education, I'd say. That's important. That's the most important for now. Canadians have to understand and take the time over the holiday period to read this document and understand what the approach really is. What is cannabis? It's not just a drug. It is something that has to be understood, that can be used by patients, doctors. We have to begin to educate ourselves about this product. It's not just research. It is something that we must begin immediately to establish a baseline to have an image in our minds before the changes start occurring. We are preparing the groundwork.
The list, we're 5 minutes over, but I recall your staff were really wanting to make sure that the West Coast got in, so perhaps we could just squeeze one off the phones and then we'll wrap. So, operator, are you there? Do you have a questioner, please?
Certainly. Our first question is from David Brown from List Cannabis News. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The report mentions that you visited several compassion clubs and dispensaries in Canada as well, and I was wondering if you could speak to what you learned there and that experience.
Do you want me to go first? A number of the task force visited the BC Compassion Club. I believe it is the oldest, or very close to being the oldest compassion club in the country, David. And what we saw there was a holistic approach where cannabis, the use of cannabis in whatever form, is part and parcel of a wellness approach. And we had the opportunity to meet not only with the people who've run the Compassion Club for many years, but also patients, members of their board of directors, those who provide advice and information to those who come through the Compassion Club's doors. I think, look, we do have to be honest that presently that which is being done there is illegal, at least part. Let me be clear, some part of that which they are doing. But they, in fact, I now believe, are licensed under the City of Vancouver application process, as some other dispensaries have been licensed in that city. That obviously raises a host of other issues. But I think what we learned there, not putting to one side certain issues of illegality, is that there can be a holistic, wellness-based approach, street-level approach that serves generally highly marginalized populations, and that this is a model, if you want to call it that the report references and suggests that governments should take a look at going forward.
Dave, do you have a supplementary? If not, I'm going to wrap this.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Let's see if he has a backup. Operator, are you going to put him on for a supplementary?
We have no further questions.
Great. Thank you very much.
Happy
holidays. Merry Christmas.
Yes, happy holidays, everyone.